Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History Valley podcast. I'm live with Dr. Frank Hughes tonight, and we're going to be talking about the other Pauls, examining Paul's letters and the Pseudo-Pauls, but specifically the Pauls that came after Paul. That's the point, and that's the meaning of the title. And that being said, Frank, thank you for joining me tonight.
Well, it's my pleasure. This has been a busy day, and it looks like the rest of November is going to be busy too.
So I'm going to go ahead and pull up your PowerPoint presentation, and we can get started.
Okay.
I got it up on the screen now.
Yes. All right. Well, the Pauls after Paul. There was a dissertation. I think his name was Jan Redalier, who wrote a book that was entitled in French, Paul After Paul, and that was about the pastoral epistles. So yeah, the incarnations of Paul after Paul, and of course the ones that I'm going to be dealing with are the ones that are in the New Testament, and there are other Pauls too, no doubt. But the primary evidence that we have for the Pauline letters, which are the primary evidence for Paul, is the manuscripts of these letters in either complete or nearly complete manuscripts of the New Testament, and manuscripts of all or part of the Pauline corpus. And of course, we have uncial manuscripts written in all capital letters, you know, the great uncials like Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, and Codex Alexandrinus from the 4th and 5th centuries CE. And we now have manuscripts of the Pauline corpus going back to the end of the 2nd century. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see I just simply copied the list of papyri manuscripts, and these were written in capital letters as well. And these are the ones listed in the 28th edition of Nestle Aland that had to do with the Pauline corpus. The ones that I didn't put in, like 1 through 9, etc., are of the Gospels. But these are manuscripts of the Pauline corpus. And the Roman numeral after them refers to the century in which they are dated. The most important one probably is P46, the Chester Beatty Papyrus, and it's dated to the end of the 2nd century, about 200. And then there are others that are dated, for example, P32. And then there are others that are dated, quite a number that are in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And so given the papyri, and then given the great uncials, such as Codex Vaticanus, which has been around since the 15th century or before, as well as Sinaiticus, which was discovered by Tischendorf in the 19th century, as well as Alexandrinus, we have an excellent textual basis to be able to say this is a very good textual basis for the letters of Paul. And counting all of the manuscripts of all or part of the New Testament, we have around 5,700 manuscripts of the New Testament, which is extremely impressive. The papyri are listed first now, of course, because they are the earliest. Let's go on. The other thing that I always tell students is that I want to use the term Pauline corpus, and we need the term Pauline corpus because we need a neutral term to talk about the documents in the New Testament from Romans through Hebrews in that usual order. And that includes the letters of generally undisputed Pauline authorship, starting chronologically with 1 Thessalonians and Galatians, and then ending with Romans. And the next slide has the letters of very disputed Pauline authorship, namely the 3 Deutero-Pauline letters and the 3 pastoral letters. And then after that, you got another slide, and that 14th member of the Pauline corpus is not really form critically a letter. It surely is not written by Paul. I think you can be morally certain it's not written by Paul. And it's not particularly written to Hebrews per se. So this is sort of the kind of baseline stuff that you have to talk about before you talk with students. And when you deal with Pauline authorship, which is something you have to deal with when you teach Intro to the New Testament, as I have taught it many times, you have to talk about the problem of Pauline authorship of the letters of the Pauline corpus. And so if you go to the next slide, my perspective is that there are three kinds of evidence that exist that you need to consider when you are dealing with the problem of the authorship of the letters of the Pauline corpus. And the three kinds of evidence are historical evidence, namely, did these letters exist? Were they quoted by anybody early on? Then literary evidence, to which I would add rhetorical evidence. I would put literary and rhetorical together. And then what we'll talk a lot about tonight is theological evidence. Namely, does the theology of the letters that are in question really match the theology of the letters that we don't have questions about? So historical evidence, literary, rhetorical evidence, and theological evidence are the three kinds of evidence that are the most important. Let's go on. When you're dealing with Paul, there is a great deal of evidence. There are the actual manuscripts of Pauline letters as early as the late 2nd century CE, starting, I think, with P46. There are, for historical evidence, there are the quotations and allusions to Pauline letters in subsequent Christian writings. And then there is also oral tradition that was told by word of mouth concerning Paul's ministry in churches around the Mediterranean Sea. And this is not the same as letters. The tradition is Paul taught this, Paul did that, Paul sailed to wherever. And so there is a tradition that was alive and well in Pauline churches, Gentile churches, that Paul was here and he founded our church. And then there is this wonderful long list of greetings in Romans 16, 1 through 16. And a lot of people tried to hack chapter 16 off of Romans. And Harry Gamble's very famous dissertation, The Textual History of the Letter of the Romans, showed conclusively that Romans 16 was an original part of Romans. Now, I don't include verses 17 through 20 of chapter 16, but chapter 16, verses 1 through 16, this is how Romans circulated. In other words, with all 16 chapters. And so there are all these people that Paul greets. And then that raises many questions. And the greetings appear to be people that Paul either knew from churches that he founded, maybe he's baptized some of them, or churches in which he ministered. Or it may be that Paul is greeting people that he has heard about and that he has understood would be in Rome, perhaps on business, at least part of the time. Exactly what the connection of Paul is to all of the people in the greetings in Romans 16, that's a very good question. And then, of course, there are written texts in the Acts of the Apostles relating to Paul's ministry in different cities. And some of the stuff in Acts may well go back to oral tradition of, okay, Paul sailed to such and such, Paul was in jail in such and such a place, and we remember this. And the writer of Acts has access to that. And then there's also, interestingly enough, the rhetoric against Paul recorded in 2 Corinthians 10:10. They say, Paul says, they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his appearance is the appearance of weakness, and his oral rhetoric, his logos, is really bad. And then, of course, there's polemic against Paul or Pauline theology in James. And there is certainly polemic against Paul in the Pseudo-Clementine writings, which come to us from Jewish Christianity. So this is very important historical evidence that is most likely to point to the existence of Paul. Let's go on to the next letter, to the next slide. There are also quotes and allusions to the Pauline letters in the next group of early Christian literature, namely the Apostolic Fathers. First Clement has quotes from 1 Corinthians and Hebrews and Romans, by the way, not 2 Corinthians. It may have other allusions, which are very debatable. The Epistle of Barnabas has apparent quotes from Romans and Ephesians and Hebrews. Ignatius of Antioch has quotes from various Pauline letters that Ignatius seems to know about. The Epistle of Polycarp to the Philippians has allusions, at least, to these Pauline letters. By the way, the first time 2 Thessalonians appears is as an allusion in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. And then there is the Shepherd of Hermas, where there are quotes and allusions. And of course, 2 Clement seems to know of Hebrews. And if you go to the next slide, you have two writers that are among the many writers that we call the apologists that are in the 2nd century. An early one is Theophilus of Antioch, and he has a bunch of quotes. And I found these quotes in Robert Grant's Oxford Early Christian Texts edition of Theophilus. And then if you look in the Parker edition of the Clement of Alexandria, the English translation of Clement of Alexandria, Clement lived in the late 2nd century and early 3rd century. He was head of the catechetical school in Alexandria, and which certainly seems to arguably be the intellectual capital of early Christianity. He was the head of the school there after Pantaenus and before Origen. And he seems to quote and allude to all the letters of the Pauline corpus. So you can see that in the 2nd century, there is quite a number of writers that either have direct quotes or some perhaps indirect quotes, and maybe some of the quotes are referred to because people have heard them, and these are being written down from memory, for example. Let's go on to the next slide. Bauer was the father of modern Pauline studies, and he wrote the first great book on Paul in 1845. The 2nd edition was published after his death by his son-in-law, and he referred to all of the letters other than Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. He referred to those as the Hauptbriefe, the main letters. And then all of the letters, except for the pastorals, he referred to all the rest of them as the Deutero-Pauline letters. And then the pastoral letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, he referred to those as the Trito-Pauline letters. And so you can see that Bauer thought that the pastoral letters were further away from Paul than the Deutero-Pauline letters. So let's go on. Usually it is thought among those who believe that Colossians is not by Paul. Colossians is believed by a bare majority of scholars, perhaps, to be the first Deutero-Pauline letters. And one of the major things that has happened in Colossians is that eschatology has been strongly de-emphasized. And in fact, in Colossians, we're up there with Paul and Christ in heaven. And human rules don't matter anymore. And you have this cosmic Christ, the Christ hymn in Colossians 1, 15 through 20. And then what is said in the two verses right before the Christ hymn that speaks of where Christians are at the present time. So, given that Paul's theology is deeply apocalyptic and deeply eschatological, at least the Paul of 1 Thessalonians through Romans, then when you see a de-emphasis on eschatology, that gives you the idea that, gosh, this might not be by Paul. And then if you go to the next slide, I think I say a little more about Colossians. Yes. I believe that Paul's eschatology is the center of Paul's theology. And I would say that Paul's eschatology is the central presupposition of Paul's theology. And I would say the central achievement of Paul's theology is justification. And Paul's eschatology in his authentic letters shows some development, which is not exactly surprising. So let's go on. Let's see. If you were to look at the next slide, you can see that there is a list of there's a list of passages in, that's it, in 1 Thessalonians 1, 9, and 10, where he says, you turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God and to wait for his Son from heaven, Jesus, who saves us from the wrath that is coming. And then in 4:13 through 5:3, which is the third proof of 1 Thessalonians, you have what is going to happen at the day of the Lord. And then you have 1 Corinthians 7, where he says, well, you can get married if you want, but it would really be better to stay a virgin. And you can buy your freedom if you want, but after all, in view of the coming disaster, namely the second coming of Jesus, you might want to forbear from that. And then in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes a detailed refutation of those who don't believe in the resurrection, which Paul taught the Corinthian church when he was there in the founding visit. And then you have in Philippians, Paul actually seems to think, Paul says, it would be better to die and to be with Christ. Then in Romans 8, the latter part of Romans 8 is about the, if you have the judgment scene, and if God is for us, who will be against us? In other words, God has already decided the case that we are justified and will be saved. And that's what Romans 8, the latter part of Romans 8, is about. And then you have also the whole issue of the salvation of Jews in Romans 9, 10, and 11. And of course, then you can see in Romans 11:26, that enigmatic verse, and so in this way, all Israel will be saved. And so there it's speaking of salvation as a future event. And that's in great contrast with Colossians. So if you go on, Colossians and Ephesians have a lot of theology in common. And probably the reason for that is that Ephesians has a copy of Colossians. They have a literary relationship to each other. Most scholars who study the thing have said that the writer of Ephesians had a copy of Colossians, and a few scholars, not many, think that the writer of Colossians had a copy of Ephesians. Let's go on. When you compare Paul's eschatology to Colossians and Ephesians, Paul's eschatology is strongly futurist. And Paul looks to the future for the final fulfillment of eschatology. Paul believes in a last judgment. And Paul is quite certain the last judgment has not yet happened when Paul wrote. Let's go on. You can go to the next. Paul's eschatology is believed to be close to the center of Paul's theology. And so let's go on to the next. The eschatology of Colossians seems to be very different. It's a fulfilled eschatology rather than a futurist eschatology. And I give you a bunch of passages in Colossians, and particularly Colossians 1:13 and 14 is very, very, very important. Elsewhere in Colossians, he says, if you are risen with Christ, seek the things that are above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. And if you're seeking the things that are above, why are you worried about the things that actually happen on earth, including earthly rules? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. These are earthly rules, and properly informed Pauline Christians understand themselves to be above. They are actually with Christ in heaven. So this is a big, big change between the eschatology of Paul's authentic letters, between them and Colossians. And let's go on to the next. And then other issues which make it difficult to believe that Paul wrote Colossians or Ephesians. And that is, in the authentic Pauline letters, we have local information about the church because Paul founded the church. Now, I admit Paul didn't found the church in Colossae. And according to Acts, Paul was in jail in Ephesus. But there's nonetheless the lack of local details about the church in Colossae and also in Ephesus. Paul had been in Ephesus and founded the church there, I guess. And Colossae is 100 miles away from Ephesus. But most importantly, there's no direct quote of Colossians or Ephesians in First Clement in 95 to, I would date First Clement in the last decade of the first century, but it could be dated in the first 2 decades of the second century. But whenever you date it, you don't have really demonstrable quotes from Colossians or Ephesians. Let's go on. There are other issues that have to do with the Pauline authorship. We have a higher number of hapax legomena. A hapax legomenon is a word that's only used once in Greek. And so we have a higher number of hapax legomena in Colossians and Ephesians, which are words only used once, than in the authentic Pauline letters. Colossians has 34 hapax legomena, and Ephesians has 82. And then Colossians and Ephesians also share 38 words only used in these 2 letters in the New Testament. And so the theological differences between Colossians and Ephesians versus the undoubted letters are more important than the linguistic differences, but the linguistic differences are certainly important. And of course, they're quantifiable. Let's go on. My perspective on the Deutero-Pauline letters is that they were written by disciples of Paul who admired his life and work very, very much, and who wanted to preserve his theology for succeeding generations. Let me see. And in other words, during Paul's lifetime, Paul was never an undisputed authority figure. Just read the Corinthian correspondence. Lord have mercy. Paul was not an undisputed authority figure in Corinthians, even though he had been in the church quite a bit. But after Paul's death, at least as it looks in the Deutero-Pauline letters, he was believed to be so important an authority figure in Pauline, generally Gentile churches, if not completely Gentile churches, that his authentic letters were already in circulation in churches. And these authentic letters were considered to be worthy of imitation by Colossians. And of course, in Colossians 4:16, it says, see this letter, share this letter with the Laodiceans, and also read the letter that I wrote to the Laodiceans. And so these theologians, it appears, in some Pauline traditions, perceive the need to update Paul by having Pauline letters respond to situations that didn't arise during the lifetime of the historical Paul. And so let's go on. You can see that of the 3 Deutero-Pauline letters, among scholars that accept non-Pauline authorship of any letters other than Ephesians, other than Hebrews, of course, there is the most agreement against the Pauline authorship of Ephesians. And most New Testament scholars who believe that Ephesians was not written by Paul agree that the writer of Ephesians had a copy of Colossians, and already mentioned the higher number of hapax legomena, including 38 words, which are only used in Ephesians and Colossians together. So let's go on to the next. Ephesians also shares the perspective of Colossians, and it focuses on the present life of the Christian. And he talks about people being in the epuranioi, the super heavenly places where Christ is. And so in Paul's letters, you have the body of Christ, which is the church here on earth. And in Ephesians and Colossians, especially Colossians perhaps, the body of Christ is cosmic. We Christians are a part of that cosmic body. In other words, Ephesians and Colossians seem to reason that since the body of Christ, the church is the body of Christ, if Christ is in heaven, i.e., that means that we're in heaven too. See? So this is a step that Paul never took in his authentic letters, but this is a cosmic, perhaps, I don't have an objection to the term Gnosticizing. It's a reinterpretation of Paul's theology of the body of Christ, which is in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12. The body of Christ is now cosmic. So let's go on. And there seems to be maybe bits and pieces of a little bit of Paul's futurist eschatology left in Ephesians, but not much. And there are a couple of places that I can identify a futurist eschatology in Ephesians 4 and Ephesians 6. But I think that shows you that Paul was understood to be, there were different Pauline traditions in Paul's churches after Paul's death. And if we didn't know that from Ephesians and Colossians, we would surely know that from 2 Thessalonians. So let's go on to the next. It's notable that Ephesians 1 through 3, the first 3 chapters, are very doctrinal, and Ephesians 4 through 6 is quite practical. And that means that Ephesians is structured in a different way than the letters of Paul that we don't have problems with. Ephesians 4 through 6 focuses on the issue of proper behavior of members of Pauline churches. There's interest in what the proper behavior for members of various sectors of society is. And you do, of course, have the household rules. So let's go on to 2 Thessalonians. The authorship of 2 Thessalonians has been debated since 1801, when Johann Ernst Christian Schmidt denied that Paul wrote it. And he seems to have been the first to deny this. And then later, in 1845, and then in a subsequent article as well, Bauer denied that Paul wrote it. And he also denied that Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians or Philippians or Philemon, etc. So really, for Bauer, the only authentic Pauline letters were Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. And he used the term the Hauptbriefe, the main letters. And we still use that term. Let's go on to the next. In my book on 2nd Thessalonians, Early Christian Rhetoric, and 2nd Thessalonians, which was published in January of 1989. It was supposed to come out in 88. And it's now available from Bloomsbury Publishing. You can buy it on Amazon. And I argued that Colossians and Ephesians represented a kind of left-wing Paulinism, that basically dropped or radically cut back Paul's eschatology. And I argued that 2 Thessalonians was a right-wing response to the dropping of eschatology. And that's why you have the signs of, here are the signs that have to have taken place before the day of the Lord actually comes. And that's in contrast to 1 Thessalonians, where it says there are not going to be any signs that precede the day of the Lord. It's going to be like a thief in the night. So 2 Thessalonians quotes from 1 Thessalonians. There certainly is a literary relationship between 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians, but the eschatology is certainly different. Let's go on. And so I argued that in chapters 4 and 5 of that book, I argued that the writer of the Pseudo-Pauline letters should not be seen as weak epigones or mere imitators of Paul, but actually as creative theologians in their own right. And I did say in the end of chapter 4, I said that 2 Thessalonians is, quote, full of apocalyptic fire and yet chillingly cold. And Bob Jewett really liked that phrase. He didn't agree with the dissertation, but he saw that it got published in this Sheffield series. And then later, he became one of the editors of the series. But anyway, let's go on. And so then I'm not going to say too much tonight about the pastoral epistles, because I think there is much more of a consensus that Paul didn't write the pastorals. Two of the pastorals, 1 Timothy and Titus, have this big interest in church order. And then the apostolos, i.e. Paul, is no longer around. The only way you have the apostle Paul around is in his letters. And so the two main deputies of Paul from the letters are Timothy and Titus, which we know about from Corinthians and Galatians. And now the tradition has given specific information to Timothy and to Titus, ostensibly by Paul. And there are general directions as to how to structure the church. In Philippians 1:1, there is the greetings to the episkopoi as well as diakonoi. In other words, there are multiple diakonoi and there are multiple episkopoi, plural, in Philippians. By the way, in the authentic Pauline letters, presbyteros is not used, although it is used in Acts. And then in 1 Timothy, there are also widows. And the writer of 1 Timothy wants to have Paul make it clear that you want to keep as many women off the payroll of the church as possible. And so I do not, only if you think Paul wrote these letters, would you want to date these by the end of the 1st century CE. And this is the reason why the question of Pauline authorship is so important, because the question of Pauline authorship has everything to do with the dating of these letters. So let's go on. The pastorals, by the way, in the pastorals, you have a single episkopos in the church, single episkopos, whereas in Philippians, you have multiple episkopoi. The other thing is that in Paul's authentic letters, Paul can speak of himself and Apollos as diakonoi. And in Paul's own letters, diakonoi seems to be a general term for anyone who ministers. Whereas in the pastorals, the diakonos is subordinate to the presbyter and the presbyters are subordinate to the bishop, or the bishop is one of the presbyters. That's a good thorny issue right there. But anyway, the letters of the Pauline corpus, which bear Paul's name and are not really by him, are not anonymous. They are pseudonymous. And that's very important to their interpretation, because it is Paul's ethos, Paul's character, not the ethos of anybody else, not the ethos of the man in the moon, which is being claimed. And it's part of the persuasion of the letters. Namely, if Aristotle was right in that you have logos and pathos that are persuasive. Also, ethos is persuasive, meaning character. And so when you're doing pseudonymity, you are borrowing the ethos of Paul in this case, and Paul's ethos is borrowed so that it's part of the rhetoric of these letters. And so the use of Paul's ethos is central to the rhetoric of the Pseudo-Pauline and pastoral letters. It tells the readers that it is actually not Joe or the man down the block, but it was actually Paul who is saying what these letters said. Let's go on. And thus, one of the results of the identification. Oops. I'm sorry. Here I am. I'm back. One of the results of the identification of pseudonymity is their use of the ethos of Paul makes great historical sense given the existence of Paul, who is now dead. Paul's work originally as a traveling church planter and a traveling church corrector, as well as the existence and early circulation of Paul's letters in the 1st century and apparently in the 2nd century too. Note that while the Acts of the Apostles never mentions any letters of Paul, and by the way, you don't have letters of Paul, and I don't know whether the writer of Acts knows the letters of Paul. I'm skeptical about that. But the main thing that you can take from Acts is that there's no mention of any need for any letters that correct any Pauline congregation. By the way, Acts gives you the idea that after the Jerusalem conference, they had this cute meeting in Acts 15 where they discussed the freedom of the Gentiles not to keep Torah, not to be circumcised, etc. And it was agreed that Paul's deputy, being a Gentile, did not need to be circumcised. And of course, the circumcision controversy is what the Jerusalem conference was about. And so, that issue is not around anymore. In the Corinthian correspondence, know nothing of the circumcision issue. Maybe Romans does. But in other words, Acts wants to tell you that after they had that meeting in Jerusalem, they shook hands on everything. Everything was hunky-dory. And then Paul and the others went and did missionary work. And the early Christians didn't fight with anymore, except maybe Paul and Barnabas fought over Mark. But you don't have congregations that are in deep conflict with each other, according to Acts. And of course, you have to decide whether you think that that's historical in the light of Corinthians. If you don't think that Paul existed in the 1st century, probably in the 50s, then you're arguing against the evidence of Acts, which is secondary evidence of what Paul said and did, and you're arguing against the primary evidence of what Paul did, namely the letters of undisputed authorship. And so I don't want to personally argue against the evidence. I want to argue with the evidence. I don't want to argue against it. That's what I taught my graduate students to do. Don't argue against the evidence, argue with the evidence. So let's go on. By the way, many of us have heard of William Vrede, who wrote a book on the Messianic secret in the Gospels, which was translated in 1970, called The Messianic Secret. But the original title of Albert Schweitzer's book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, the original title was Von Reimarus zu Vrede. In other words, from Reimarus to Vrede. And of course, the whole issue of the Messianic secret. But anyway, Vrede also wrote a book called Die Echtheit des Zweiten Thessalonischer Briefs untersucht. And on page 70 to 71, in my translation, here is what Vrede said. From this Paul of orthodoxy, in which he meant the authentic Pauline letters, in other words, the Paul of justification by faith, etc. From this Paul of orthodoxy, we make a clear distinction from the Paul constituted in a wholly different way by Marcion. And I believe he's referring to Marcion as the enemy of Judaism, the law, and the Old Testament. According to our epistle, meaning 2 Thessalonians, we now have, so to speak, yet another wholly different Paul before us. The Paul who was the representative of a stormy eschatological expectation, in whose letters the weightiest matters were what he said of the end. In other words, the second coming and what happens at the day of the Lord. And then, of course, Pfleiderer had probably written his book on Paulinism by this time. And there was probably a lot of discussion about what do we mean by Paulinism. And then Vrede goes on to say, this Paulinism, if we may really use such a term, remains for us an isolated fact. Whether it had a wider reaching significance, and what this was, we do not know. And so that was the state of the question in the in the discussion of 2 Thessalonians in 1903. And his book, Die Echtheit des Zweiten Thessalonischen Briefs, that was the watershed, and everybody either agreed with it or wrote against it after Vrede. So let's go on to the next slide. And so what I said about Vrede is at the end of my book. For those who accept the full implications of Vrede's landmark study of 2 Thessalonians, and my teacher Bob Jewett did not, the examination of the reception of Paul and his thought in Colossians, Ephesians, 2 Thessalonians, and the pastorals must not work with a solitary image of the apostle in mind. Rather, the several pseudo-Pauline letters only become really understandable when we posit that the theological and pastoral ethos of Paul after his death can best be understood through multiple images, and that the persons who promoted or created these multiple images were likely to have been in sharp conflict with one another. Thus, the multiple images. That's why there are multiple images. And so the indications are that each image of the apostle given by the various pseudo-Pauline writers had its context in a situation of conflict. And of course, what that means is I read the rhetoric of these letters and I said, gee, there's conflict behind this. So I think you can go on. I think I have some conclusions now. I have 5 conclusions. 1, those of us who research and teach about the letters of the Pauline corpus have to take with full seriousness the diversity of images of Paul which appeared, as far as we have evidence, in letters either edited, and of course here I refer to 1st and 2nd Corinthians in their edited canonical form, or written after the death of Paul. And I would say it's highly plausible, historically plausible, that after Paul died, multiple images of Paul would appear in early Christian writings rather than any single image of Paul. And I think William Vrede got it right. I think Otto Pfleiderer in his book Paulinism got it right. I think I got it right. And then if you go on to the final slide, you have 3 more ideas. I do not have any doubts that different texts of Pauline letters were in circulation in the 2nd century CE, maybe even the late 1st century CE. This is what Bob Jewett thought about the original Corinthian letters, which we know from their edited form in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And so, I mean, look at the list of papyri manuscripts of Paul in the 2nd century and in the 3rd century. So I think that this means that it's very, very likely that different images and texts of Paul were very much in circulation in the 2nd century and they could very well have been in circulation at the end, by the end of the 1st century. We now have, of course, the Editio Critica Maior of Mark. We now have the Editio Critica Maior of the first ones that came out were the Catholic epistles, and then there was Acts, and then there was Mark, and I think Matthew may be appearing soon, or maybe it has appeared. And needless to say, I think many Pauline scholars are looking forward to a major edition of the Pauline corpus, because without a real major edition listing every damn one of the variant readings, or almost all of the variant readings, it's kind of hard to we're not just interested in trying to find the original text of Paul or reconstruct the original text of Paul. We would also like to know, what about the other texts that circulated in the early centuries of the church? And so when we get the Novum Testamentum Graecum Editio Critica Maior of the Pauline corpus, which I think is a few years away, we should be able to see the diversity of texts of Paul that circulated in the early church. That is my hope. By the way, if you look at the final conclusion, Harry Gamble wrote a dissertation at Yale called The Textual History of the Letter to the Romans, published in Studies and Documents by Ehrman in 1977. And Bob Jewett referred to that in his pages 4 through 18, where he deals with the diversity of the textual witnesses of Romans, including the Old Latin manuscripts. And he also made use of the Papyrus Center at the University of Heidelberg. And he went to Heidelberg to finish writing his big commentary on Romans in the Hermeneia series. He spent 25 or 26 years on that commentary on Romans. And of course, the editor of that commentary on Romans was none other than Eldon J. Epp, the noted textual critic. Then, of course, we have Stephen Carlson's dissertation at Duke, The Text of Galatians and Its History, published in the Veu in Te second series in 2014. And so I think that we're talking about a pretty complicated history of the text of the Pauline corpus. And so, there's more that we would like to know. And so when I did my dissertation, I didn't really examine the text so much. Again, this was a dissertation that was accepted in 1984. And so I was, I'm a rhetorical critic. And so I examined the rhetoric of 2 Thessalonians. And I think I made a pretty damn good case against its Pauline authorship using rhetorical analysis. So I think that these letters, the Deutero-Pauline letters, like the Pauline letters, can be analyzed in different ways using different methods, and I think they should be. So that's what I have to say, and so I think that is our last slide.
We got a super chat question. Solara Knight, thank you for your super chat. 2 Corinthians 12, Paul states 14 years ago, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things. Surpassingly great revelations. Seems cult of Paul predating the whole Jesus story. Explain.
Well, yes, I think the Pauline letters predate the Gospels in their written form. That doesn't mean that material about the life of Jesus and material about what Jesus said and did, that was in fact circulating around, possibly in written form, more likely in oral form as far as we have evidence. But the Pauline letters are predate that, as most scholars think. By the way, the thing about the man in Christ who was carried up to the third heaven and all that is part of the satire. I agree. It's part of the satire of the 4-chapter letter, which we call letter F. And so if you look in our book, The Corinthian Correspondence, Redaction, Rhetoric, and History, one of the chapters deals with the 4-chapter letter. which is what we call Corinthian F. I'm quite certain heavy duty satire.
Do you think that these revisions in the theological thoughts of the Deutero-Pauline community and the Pseudo-Pauline communities, were they happening simultaneously with the Gospels, or are these theological revisions, in a sense, independent of the composition of the Gospels?
I think that they considered themselves Pauline communities because in these letters, Paul is the apparently undisputed authority figure. And so they considered themselves Pauline churches, ecclesiae, gatherings, assemblies. And so they considered themselves Pauline churches. And of course, it's because they had Pauline letters. They had Pauline letters, and they began to sort of copy each other's letters exactly as Colossians 4:16 says. Okay, copy the letter that I wrote to the Laodiceans, and see that you read the letter, and let them also read a copy of this letter. And so that's a clear allusion to copying of letters from different churches by different churches. And that's why we have the Pauline is because they were copied in Pauline churches. How different were these churches from each other? That's a wonderful question. I'm not sure that we can answer that question except by reading the letters and trying to figure out the theology of each letter, and then trying to figure out where is the Zitzimleben of this, of this theological whatever it is, most likely to have sprung from. So I think that that's the problem of trying to reconstruct a theology from letters. We can reconstruct Pauline theology as we do because we have so many Pauline letters that are, as far as I believe, authentic Pauline letters. Admittedly, the Corinthian correspondence is edited. I certainly don't think that 1 Corinthians 14:33b through 36 is an authentic letter, where women got to be silent in church. I don't think that Paul wrote that at all. I don't think that Paul wrote the pastorals where Paul says something very much like that. First Timothy. And also agree with Bob Jewett that the thing in Romans 16 verses 17 through 20, where it says anybody that don't agree with you, throw their butts out, or words to that effect. Bob Jewett wrote a good sized book called Christian Tolerance, Paul's Message to the Modern Church. And so he argued that the major part of what Paul was trying to do in Romans was trying to get the support of Roman house church, but he said Roman house churches to try to get their support, in other words, pulling strings and writing letters of introduction and maybe money, so that he can reasonably launch a mission to Spain. And so Paul has to be very, very diplomatic in Romans. And therefore, in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, the importance of the meat that was perhaps offered in pagan worship, the importance is not the meat itself, but what eating the meat would do to the conscience of a weaker brother or sister. And Paul agrees with that in Romans 12 through 15. So I think Bob got it right when he talked about Paul as speaking in favor of tolerance, including women who are apostles. Greet Andronicus and Eunia, a well-attested Roman female name, who are well known among the apostles, not well known to the apostles because of the preposition in, well known among the apostles. And then Phoebe, who is a diakonos, which here should not be treated as deacon. And of course, the word deacon didn't exist until the 4th century. But a diaconus is a minister, including Paul and Apollos. And she is the diaconus of the church at Cenchrea, which is one of the two ports of Corinth. And she is Paul's minister plenipotentiary. She probably carried the letter and read the letter to the Romans, and made an oral presentation of that letter to the diverse Roman house churches. And so when Paul doesn't seem to make much of a distinction between males and females as apostoloi and as diakonoi, as far as we know from Romans 16, then if women are never in the leadership in Pauline churches, why is 1 Corinthians 14:33b through 36 and 1 Timothy, why are those snippets so intent on throwing women out of leadership if they were never in leadership in Pauline churches to begin with? See? So I think the original Pauline churches, I'm not saying that women were equal in Pauline churches, but I think they may have been nearly equal. Women have to have their head covered apparently with hair, longer hairstyles rather than shorter hairstyles in 1 Corinthians 11. That was probably mistranslated by Jerome, where he says they are velata or velatus, meaning, and that's been translated as veiled. And so there's a whole tradition of women got to be veiled in church, women wearing these veils in church. In the Episcopal Church, we used to see the women wearing we used to call them doilies, or they were called chapel caps. And you were supposed to wear your little damn doily in church. And when women started being ordained, the doilies went away. So in any event, I think that there are the authentic Pauline letters. 1st and 2nd Corinthians reflect editing and reflect the desire to subordinate women to men. 1 Timothy reflects that same idea. But again, I repeat, if women were never in the leadership of Pauline churches, why do they need to be thrown out of leadership by 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 6? So I think that there are these Pauline churches after Paul's death. And of course, Paul could only barely keep the lid on things during his lifetime by writing them letters to kind of get them back on track as Paul saw it. And of course, if we are correct in finding 8 Corinthian letters and letter fragments embedded in the edited form of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, most of Paul's letters to the Corinthian church were not effective. They didn't work. Finally, it's the nasty letter F, that seems to have worked. See? We also don't know that the Corinthians ever actually contributed to relieve the saints in Jerusalem. So we don't know that the Galatians ever contributed to it, and we don't know that the Corinthians ever contributed to it. Isn't that interesting? So it may be that Pauline churches, I mean, they're very interesting entities during Paul's lifetime, to say the least, but then perhaps after Paul's death. And so all the more important, therefore, to try to read the Deutero-Pauline and pastoral letters very carefully to see what we can find that stands behind the text.
And I want to remind everybody real quick that the links to purchase Dr. Frank Hughes' books will be in the description below and the pinned comment, including the Rust and Redeemer YouTube channel that he appears on. And that being said, Frank, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel.
Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.